Okay, I'm Nathan from the Charles Sumner, and this is a poem of poetry. A poem of poetry can be about anything because poems can be about anything. Poems can be about a guy who jumped off a ship, so a poem of poetry can be about that too. But a poem about poetry with a topic of poetry made up of poems can't be a single poem. That's just way too much to write about. So a poem about poetry really depends on the poetry part of it, right? What I'm trying to say is that there's such thing as a poem about poetry. A poem of poems would be different from a poem about poetry. A poem of poetry would go something like this. Hickory dickory dock, blazed with rainwater, looking out at me. Famous poets write famous poems, but what does a poem of different poem look like? Well, your answer was in the last stanza. Lots of good poets write good poetry. Lots of okay poets write okay poetry. But what do bad poets write? A poem about poetry would go something like this. Poetry originated in ancient times where everybody talked but nobody rhymed. Okay, that rhymes, but most of these stanzas don't, so I'll tell you why. Because there are ballads, elegies, odes, limericks, villanelles, sonnets, free verse, and acrostic, and that's your poem about poetry.